And so the silence descends, not as a gentle blanket but as a stark, unyielding mirror. You call it loneliness, this chasm that opens when the echoes of others fade. Is it their absence you mourn, or the sudden deafening roar of your own presence, untamed and unshielded? Watts might have smiled at this, that subtle, knowing smile, seeing us grapple with the very space we are. This harshness, this truth you seek, it isn't a monster lurking in the shadows of solitude. It is the realization that the you seeking connection is perhaps the architect of the separation. The world hums, oblivious to the tremor in your chest. The universe expands, indifferent to the walls you build or the bridges you burn. And in that vast indifference, a strange liberation flickers. For what if this loneliness isn't a lack but a confrontation, a stripping away of borrowed identities, of reflected warmth until only the core remains, stark and shivering, yet undeniably, irrevocably, present? The chatter you miss, was it ever truly yours? Or was it a distraction, a comfortable noise to drown out the disquieting symphony of the self, alone in its boundless room? The truth of it bites, not with malice, but with the cold precision of a winter morning, revealing the landscape as it simply is, before the sun attempts to soften its edges. Consider the frantic dance away from this stillness you've named loneliness, a carnival of connections, faces flickering like faulty lights, each promising to fill a void that perhaps isn't empty, but merely quiet. Watts spoke of the self as a wave, distinct for a moment, yet always the ocean. What if this desperate flight from solitude is a flight from the ocean's immensity, a terror of dissolving back into the truth of what you are? The harshness isn't in the being alone, but in the sudden, unwelcome clarity of the props and costumes. The roles you play, the lines you recite to assure yourself and others of a solid, unshakable me, they become transparent in the unwavering gaze of your own solitude. This ache for another, is it for their presence or for the validation of your own imagined outline? The truth bites deeper here, suggesting that the loneliness you feel is not an absence of others, but a presence of a profound, often unacknowledged demand. The demand that the universe and those within it constantly affirm your constructed self. When the applause dies down and the audience leaves, you are left with the bare stage. Is it empty? Or is it finally ready for a different kind of play, one without a script, without a predefined role? The fear is not of silence, but of what you might hear when everything else stops making noise. This loneliness, does it not whisper of a forgotten wholeness, a primal unity you vaguely recall yet cannot quite grasp? The harsh truth, perhaps, is that you are seeking outside what can only be, and always has been, within, not a separate, fortified self, but the very fabric of existence. Watts might point to the breath, this constant companion, this effortless exchange with the universe. When did you begin to feel its rhythm was not enough, the chase for another's hand to hold, another's eyes to reflect you? Is it not a subtle distrust of your own ground, your own sky? The void you perceive in solitude is often the space cleared by the absence of illusion, the uncomfortable expanse where the ego can no longer see its reflection, and it panics, this small, insistent I, fearing it will vanish without external mirrors. But what if vanishing is a form of arrival? What if the solidity you crave is the very cage that creates the loneliness? This ache isn't for a person or a multitude. It is the echo of a universe breathing within you, wanting to be acknowledged not as other, but as the source. The harshness is in the letting go of the idea that you are a fragment to be mended, rather than a complete, albeit momentarily bewildered, note in an infinite song. Listen closely in the quiet. The melody of that song is precisely what you mistake for silence. Imagine the word, loneliness, stripped of its cultural costume, its centuries of accumulated dread. What remains? A state of being, just that, to be alone. But the word itself arrives laden, a vessel carrying ancestral anxieties, societal judgments, the curated narratives of what constitutes a full life. The harsh truth Alan Watts might illuminate is that you are often battling the ghost of a word, more than the reality of the state. This perceived emptiness, is it truly empty? Or is it a space unburdened by the expectations of others? A field where your own uncultivated thoughts can finally sprout? Society sells connection as a panacea, a constant hum of interaction as a sign of vitality. Yet what if this relentless pursuit of not aloneness is a subtle running from the self, a fear of the vast uncharted territory within? The ache you attribute to absence might be the growing pains of a consciousness, straining against the confines of a too small definition of me. Watts often spoke of the universe at play, of the cosmic dance. Perhaps this solitude is not a wallflower's retreat, but but an invitation to a different rhythm, a slower, deeper cadence that the marketplace of noise cannot teach. The harshness is the dissonance you feel when the inner rhythm clashes with the outer demand for perpetual engagement. It's the stark recognition that the comfort of the crowd might be the price of a more profound, unsettling, yet ultimately liberating self-acquaintance. What if this loneliness is not a deficiency but a fierce, untamed presence you've been taught to muzzle? The harsh truth might be that within its silent howl lies a power you both crave and fear, the power of unfiltered self-encounter. Watts often dismantled our cherished dualities, the good versus bad, the sought versus the shunned. Could it be that in fleeing loneliness, you flee a vital energy, a raw, unmediated experience of being? Consider the landscape of your inner world when no one is watching, no one is expected. Does it not breathe differently? Does it not yearn to shed the carefully constructed persona that performs so admirably in the light of others? This ache for connection, trace it back. Is it truly for another, or is it for a release from the exhausting labor of upholding an image? The solitude you resist, perhaps it is the only state where the mask can finally be laid down, not in defeat, but in profound relief. The harshness, then, is the sudden awareness of the mask's weight, the years spent carrying it, mistaking its painted smile for your own. Watts might suggest that the universe doesn't demand this performance. The stars don't ask you to be brilliant. The mountains don't ask you to be steadfast, they simply are. And in your aloneness, you touch upon that same elemental truth of your own being, a truth that requires no audience, no applause, only a courageous willingness to be still and see. This state you call loneliness, is it not also a confrontation with the raw, ungovernable pulse of existence itself, stripped of the narratives that attempt to tame it? Watts saw the folly in our relentless efforts to control, to pin down, to make life predictable. The harsh truth is that loneliness can feel like a sudden loss of that illusion of control. The carefully arranged pieces of your life, the relationships, the routines, the distractions, they momentarily cease to obscure the vast, indifferent machinery of the cosmos and the smallness of the I that seeks to command it. Does this chill you, this momentary glimpse of the puppet master's strings realizing they are not and never were in your hands? Perhaps the lonely feeling is the ego's protest against its own insignificance in this grand, unscripted play. You reach for another, not just for comfort, but to reaffirm your story, to have your lines echoed back, to feel the solidity of a shared script. But what if the script itself is the confinement? What if the terror of its absence is the prelude to an unforeseen liberation? The universe, in its silent majesty, does not offer personalized reassurances. Its beauty and its terror are impartial. The harshness lies in accepting this impartiality, in understanding that the waves of connection and disconnection are natural rhythms, like tide and breath, not punishments or rewards for the striving self. To be truly alone is perhaps to touch that rhythm, to feel the ebb and flow without the desperate need to hold on to the crest. Is there not a subtle violence in the way we flee from our own company, a self-rejection woven into the fabric of our frantic seeking? The harsh truth Alan Watts might gently unfold is that the loneliness we decry is often the echo of an inner space we have refused to inhabit, a sanctuary we have allowed to fall into disrepair. We paper over its silence with noise, its stillness with motion, its depth with superficial engagements. Why this fear of homecoming? What specter do we imagine awaits in the quiet chambers of the self? Perhaps the real desolation is not in being alone, but in the perpetual distraction that prevents us from ever truly meeting who we are when the world is not demanding a performance. Watts encouraged an immersion in the now, this eternal moment. Yet how much of your perceived loneliness is born from a mind tethered to yesterday's absences or tomorrow's anxieties? The present moment, when truly entered, holds no such vacancies, only a fullness of being. The harshness arises when we see how consistently we abandon this fullness for the phantom limb of a desired connection or the ghost of a past one. Consider the myriad ways you are asked to be on, to be responsive, to be available. What if solitude is not a lack, but a sacred refusal, a refusal to be endlessly consumed, a reclamation of your own attention? The emptiness you dread might just be the clearing needed for something genuine and unbidden to finally take root, something that the crowded garden of your everyday life cannot accommodate. Consider the architecture of your expectations, the intricate blueprints you design for how connection should feel, how solitude should be avoided. The harsh truth, as Watts might observe, is that loneliness often rushes in through the breaches of these self-imposed structures. It is not the aloneness itself that wounds, but the story you tell about what it signifies, the meaning you superimpose upon the silence. Is it a failure? A judgment, a void? Or is it merely space, unwritten and unbound? You look to another to fill a perceived emptiness, but what if that emptiness is a phantom, a hunger cultivated by the very act of seeking external satiation? The world reflects your inner state with unnerving precision. If you carry a desert within, you will find its echo even in a crowded room. The harshness is this: the responsibility for the inner landscape is irrevocably yours. No other can plant your garden or calm your storm, though they may offer temporary shelter or fleeting blossoms. Watts spoke of embracing the rhythm of insecurity, of not clinging. Could it be that your flight from loneliness is a desperate clinging to the illusion that another can anchor you against the natural tides of your own being? To sit with the raw feeling, without naming it loneliness, without rushing to diagnose or cure, what would that reveal? Perhaps it reveals not an affliction, but a profound, even challenging invitation to meet yourself without the usual intermediaries, without the comforting shield of another's gaze. What of the self you present to the world, that carefully curated collage of acceptable traits and borrowed opinions? The harsh truth Watts might unveil is that this persona, so dependent on the reflection and reaction of others, trembles in the face of solitude. For who are you when the audience departs, when the applause fades, when the validating gaze is withdrawn? This unease you label loneliness. Is it not, in part, the terror of the persona's dissolution, the fear of confronting a self less defined, more fluid, perhaps more authentically chaotic than the one you so painstakingly maintain? You seek connection to solidify this outward self, to see its outline confirmed in the eyes of another. But Watts often pointed towards the liberation found in understanding the constructed, impermanent nature of this very ego. The you that feels lonely is perhaps the you most invested in this performance. The silence of being alone doesn't just remove external voices. It removes the cues, the prompts, the very mirrors by which the persona navigates and affirms its existence. And in this sudden, stark unmirroring, what arises? Is it emptiness, or is it the first tentative breath of a deeper, less conditioned consciousness? The harshness lies in the realization that the comfort derived from relational identity is contingent, fragile. The profound, unsettling question solitude poses is, beyond the roles you play, beyond the connections you forge or mourn, what remains? And can you bear to meet that remainder without flinching, without immediately seeking to dress it in a new costume of relation? This insistent yearning that gnaws in the quiet spaces, this ache you call loneliness, is it not a manifestation of a deeper, more pervasive human craving? Watts spoke often of the ceaseless desire for life to be other than it is, for experience to conform to our ideals. The harsh truth may be that loneliness is the raw, unadulterated experience of this discrepancy when the usual buffers are stripped away. It is the stark confrontation with the is, when you are pining for the should be, or the was. You seek another, a situation, an escape, believing it will bridge this gap. But what if the gap is inherent in the seeking itself? What if the very act of wanting to banish loneliness intensifies its presence, like struggling in quicksand? The energy you expend in pushing away the feeling of aloneness, imagine that energy turned inward, not to fight but to observe, to understand the mechanics of this internal weather. Watts might suggest that the attempt to find a permanent cure for the ebb and flow of connection and solitude is itself a source of profound disquiet. The harshness is not that you are alone, but that you resist the natural rhythm of aloneness, treating it as an anomaly, a sickness to be eradicated rather than a state with its own wisdom, its own stark beauty. What if, in the very heart of that uncomfortable sensation, lies not an enemy, but a misunderstood messenger, pointing towards a more fundamental acceptance of the ungraspable, ever-changing dance of existence? Is it possible that this loneliness you carry has become a strangely familiar cloak, a dark comfort in its very predictability? The harsh truth, as Watts might playfully prod, is that the ego can become attached even to its own suffering, weaving narratives of isolation that, while painful, reinforce a sense of self, however melancholic. To be the lonely one is, after all, a role and identity. What if the prospect of shedding this identity, of stepping out from under that cloak, is subtly more terrifying than the loneliness itself? You yearn for connection, yet do you also, perhaps, resist the dissolution of the familiar sorrow that has defined a part of your inner landscape? Watts often highlighted our tendency to take our personal dramas with an almost religious seriousness. Could this profound anguish in solitude be a symptom of an over-identification with the ego's lament, forgetting the vaster, more impersonal play of existence in which your personal story is but a fleeting scene? The harshness here is the subtle insinuation that your pain, while intensely real to you, might also be a choice. a groove worn deep by repeated thought and feeling, a channel you inadvertently deepen each time you affirm its power. What if true liberation is not the arrival of the longed-for other, but the dawning awareness that even amidst connection, a core of ineffable aloneness remains, not as a tragedy, but as an irreducible aspect of consciousness itself? The challenge, then, isn't to escape this core, but to inhabit it with a new kind of acceptance. Even curiosity, free from the script that dictates it, must be a place of lack. Consider the grand narratives of romance and perpetual companionship, the cultural edicts that paint solitude as a wasteland to be traversed only with haste and despair. The harsh truth, which Watts might dissect with a calm scalpel, is that these very ideals can become the architects of your deepest loneliness. For when reality inevitably falls short of these inflated expectations, when the promised salvation through another does not fully materialize, the resulting void can feel like a personal failing, a unique curse. But what if the failure lies not in you, nor in the other, but in the script itself, a script that places an impossible burden on human connection to eradicate a fundamental aspect of existence? This relentless societal pressure to be coupled, to be enmeshed, to broadcast joy even in its absence, does it not amplify the silence when you find yourself outside that luminous circle? The harshness is in recognizing that the chase for a cure in the form of another person might be a detour from the more profound journey inward, towards an acceptance of your own intrinsic completeness, with or without a companion. What if loneliness is not an absence of something vital, but the presence of an acute, perhaps uncomfortable awareness, an awareness of the self as a distinct current in the vast ocean of being? Watts emphasized the dance of form and emptiness. Could it be that this feeling of loneliness is a glimpse into that emptiness, not as a terrifying void, but as the boundless potential from which all forms, including connection, arise and into which they dissolve? Imagine the very fabric of your perception, woven with the threads of I and other, here and there and mine and not mine. The harsh truth Alan Watts consistently illuminated is that this ingrained duality, this fundamental sense of separation, is the very root from which the bitter flower of loneliness blooms. For if there is an I that is truly, ultimately separate, then aloneness can indeed feel like an exile, a fundamental vulnerability. But what if this I is more of a process than a fixed entity, a wave temporarily distinct from the ocean but never truly severed from it? The pain you experience as loneliness, is it not the friction generated by this illusion of separateness, rubbing against the underlying reality of interconnectedness? Consider the mountain, standing in its vast solitude. Does it lament its aloneness? Or does it simply exist in profound, unshakable communion with the sky, the wind, the earth? The harshness lies in the challenge to dismantle your most cherished conviction, that of a solitary, independent ego fighting for its place in a world of others. Watts might suggest that the true work is not to find another to soothe the ache of this perceived isolation, but to see through the very architecture of the self that feels so painfully, uniquely alone. What if the fear of loneliness is also a fear of dissolving these familiar boundaries, a fear of losing the I you have come to know, even if that I is the source of your suffering? The fortress of the ego, built to protect, can become the prison of loneliness. And the key is not always found in another's hand, but in the courageous willingness to question the very nature of the walls themselves. What if the relentless struggle against loneliness is itself the primary source of its sting? The harsh truth, as Alan Watts might gently propose, is that our suffering is often not in the raw fact of a situation, such as being physically alone, but in our fierce, unyielding resistance to it, our declaration that it should not be. This non-acceptance, this internal argument with the present moment, transforms simple solitude into a battlefield of yearning and discontent. Consider the narratives that spiral within when silence descends. Are they objective reports of reality, or are they well-worn scripts of lack, of fear, of anticipated sorrow, learned and rehearsed over a lifetime? Watts often pointed to the liberation found in observing these mental formations without immediate identification, without granting them ultimate authority. The harshness, then, is the dawning awareness that the chains of loneliness are often forged in the mind's own smith. You seek external anchors, a person, an activity, a distraction, to pull you from the perceived abyss. But what if the abyss is not the aloneness itself, but the terror projected onto it by a mind conditioned to equate solitude with failure or despair? What if the true freedom lies not in perpetually escaping your own company, but in dismantling the internal alarm system that shrieks at its presence? To sit with the sensation, stripped of its label, loneliness, stripped of the future anxieties and past regrets it typically drags in its wake, what remains? Perhaps not a monster, but a quiet space, a potential clearing where the frantic search for external validation can finally cease, revealing an unexpected sufficiency within. And so, you arrive at the heart of the matter, this harsh truth about loneliness, which, like a Zen koan, resists easy definition. Perhaps as Watts might have intimated with a knowing silence, the harshest truth is that the loneliness you've wrestled with is not an affliction to be cured, but an integral thread in the boundless tapestry of being, inseparable from joy, from connection, from the very pulse of life. It is the shadow that gives definition to the light. You have sought to understand it, to dismantle it, to escape it. But what if its ultimate teaching lies not in its resolution, but in the transformation of your relationship to it? What if the core of the problem is the incessant human urge to categorize experience as good or bad, to cling to one and reject the other, when existence itself simply is, in all its multifaceted, often paradoxical glory, the you that feels lonely, that fears the void, that craves perpetual union? Watts would gently suggest this you is the grandest illusion of all, and in seeing through this illusion, not as an intellectual concept but as a lived reality, the sting of loneliness begins to lose its power. It ceases to be a testament to your lack and becomes instead a profound invitation to rest in the vast, unnameable mystery of what you are, beyond the confines of the small separate self. The harshness softens then, not into a comfortable answer, but into a spacious acceptance of the cosmic dance, the dance of aloneness and togetherness, of silence and sound, of emptiness and form. And in that acceptance, a quiet, unshakable peace might just find room to breathe.